Hello and welcome to my video where I'm going to show you how to make a letterboard. It's basically a memo or message board but with plastic letters, and I'll be using simple supplies so it's easy to make at home. If you happen to have a 3D printer you can print the letters, otherwise you'll need to buy them. And later on I'll show you how to make a drawstring pouch to keep them in. The materials you're going to need are as follows. Right, so the first thing to do is to prepare the frame. I'm using the frame from a mounted canvas, so I first needed to remove the staples and the canvas. I did this using my staple remover. This left a basic wooden frame that's a little bit rough on the surface, so I then lightly sanded it all over. Obviously, if you're using a pre-finished picture frame or similar, you can skip this step. Next, to make the frame look a bit less ugly, I decoupaged it using some patterned paper. I first cut a strip of paper wide enough to wrap around one side of the frame, then I trimmed it down to fit bit by bit. It helps to fold the paper where you want to cut first, rather than cutting straight away. I wanted a strip per side, with all of them joining up along the miter joints. I then used a tiny bit of water to dilute some PVA glue. To attach the paper strips, I then painted the PVA glue onto the frame, laid the paper on top, and then applied more PVA on top of that. Repeat the same for every paper strip. Then leave the glue to dry. To make the backing for the frame, I recycled some card packaging. I glued 2 squares of cereal box card together, making the squares about 2 cm wider and longer than the inside opening of the frame. So you can see here I drew the outline of the opening of the frame and then added 1 centimeter on every side. I then glued a slightly larger square of stiff white cardboard to the back. This made it stronger but also looked better than the cereal box card. I then painted the front area that will be slightly visible with acrylic paint. You want to approximately match the paint colour to the colour of the felt you'll be using. Then the next step is to cut the felt into strips all the same width. Don't worry about the length of the strips just yet. If they're longer than the width of the frame opening, it's all good. Measure the vertical distance between the pegs on the back of the plastic letters, and that will tell you how wide your felt strips need to be. Mine needed to be 4 mm wide. Even though it's possible to cut with scissors, it's difficult to get a straight line. Using a rotary cutter, preferably with a new blade, and a metal ruler on a cutting mat is so much easier. To cut the felt, run the rotary cutter along the edge of your ruler repeatedly, only in the forwards direction. It helps to line up the felt with the grid on the cutting mat to make sure it's all square and straight. Note that felt can distort, but you can use this to your advantage and carefully stretch the strips of felt if you've cut them a little bit too wide. That is, as long as you've cut them in a direction that allows them to stretch. Don't stretch the strips too much though, because then they'll become uneven and too thin and fluffy. Keep testing the letters on the strips as you go, making sure the letters can be pressed onto the strip fairly easily, and don't fall off. And here you can see I've cut out all of the felt strips. You'll need enough to fill the frame, but you can always cut more strips. We then need to assemble the frame by attaching the card backing to the back of the wooden frame using strong clear glue. Then keep some heavy books or something similar on top until the glue dries. You then need to draw lines every 1 inch all the way down the front of the card. This is for the next step to allow you to make sure the felt strips stay level and don't end up slanting one way or the other. You need to leave a very narrow gap between each strip, and I left a gap that was about the same as the thickness of my metal ruler. Cut a handful of the felt strips to the correct length, apply glue to a section of the backing, and then position the felt strips onto the glue. As you attach the strips, keep testing with the letters to make sure you can push them in and they remain in place. Also make sure that the strips stay in line with the lines that you've drawn. Repeat this until the backing is completely covered. Then leave this to dry. In order to hang this up, I just attached 2 self-adhesive command strips to the back, like so. The next part is an optional extra, and I'm going to be making a drawstring pouch to keep the letters in. I decided to use velvet for the front, and I wanted to emboss it with letters. So I place wooden letters onto my ironing board, in reverse, in the positions I want them to be embossed in. I then carefully lowered the velvet, right side down, on top, sprayed the velvet with water, and pressed the iron on a low heat setting on top of the letters for about 10 seconds. If you can't see the outline of the letters on the back of the velvet, you haven't pressed for long enough. Then you should see an embossed design on the front. I wanted to have a transparent back on the pouch, so I used red organza. You want to cut a rectangle the same size out of both fabrics, and then hem all of the long edges. I did this because these fabrics move all over the place and are not stable, and hemming seems to help. If you used a stable fabric, like woven cotton for instance, instead, then you wouldn't need to hem. I personally used a black thread so you could see it, but you'll want to use a matching thread instead. Place the 2 pieces right sides together, pin, and sew along every side except the top edge. Make sure to sew inside the hems you've sewn if you've hemmed. On the long edges, stop X distance from the top edge, where X is 2 times the width you want the drawstring channel to be, plus 1/4 inch. So if you want the channel to be 1/2 inch wide, like I do, you'll want to stop sewing 1 1/4 inches from the top edge. Always remember to backstitch at the beginning and the end of your sewn lines to secure the stitches. Then use a ruler and rotary cutter to trim down all of the edges to make them straight and square. Of course, don't cut too close to the lines you've stitched. Fold down the top edge to form your channel and sew this edge in place all the way around. If you're using my previously suggested measurements, you'll want a finished channel that's 1/2 inch wide. Note that I did this wrong and sewed the channel 1 inch wide instead, but it wasn't too much of a problem, it just made it a bit harder to sew. If you don't have a sewing machine and want to sew this by hand instead, I would recommend using the backstitch. Turn the pouch right sides out, and then cut 2 pieces of cord that measure about 3 times the width of the pouch. Attach a safety pin to one end of one piece of cord and feed it into the channel on one side. Then take it through the entire channel, both sides, and back out at the same point. Repeat the same for the other piece of cord, but this time feed it into the other end of the channel to start. Knot together the ends of each cord pair and trim off the excess. And that's it, the pouch is now complete. I really hope you enjoyed this project, and thank you very much for watching.